Welcome everyone to Likhawat. And like I said, three incredible writers here with us today. Anjali Jariwala, Akanksha Aurora, and Godhuli Gupta. I think I see only Godhuli Chatterjee here, but I know she has a last name, Gupta, as well. So very, very welcome here, guys. And so happy to be here with you. And I gave a little bit of a background about you. And before we end today, I will have you guys even share what your next work is, what we should be looking at as readers. And we'll go through that. But, before we start, I'm going to dive right into our topic today and probably start with, Anjali here. She's very on the left on my screen. So I feel I'm going to start here with Anjali. And Anjali, like I was describing to people, you have a financial background. I know that you're a business pro on the run, and you're like, that's a large part of your life. And then this is very different than that. And you and I talked about it earlier, like children's books is like a whole different world. So as you wrote this book, and I know you told me earlier that, writing for your daughter was a part of the motivation, but talk to me about, how has this whole experience, how has this transformed your creative process? What have you learned through it? And talk to us about that.
Yes, sure. So, as you mentioned, I am a very analytical person, right? Like my background and training is in, finance and accounting. And so what was interesting was when I started the journey of writing Why We Eat With Our Hands, I took a very analytical approach in terms of how I was going to tap into my creative side. So I did what I would do when creating a financial plan, right? I read a lot of books on the topic. I mean, I didn't go down to writing a children's book for dummies, but I really had to start from the beginning. So some of the books I read was drawing on the right side of the brain. And then there's another book that was great that's writing picture books, right? And so kind of understanding the mechanisms and the analytical side of the process helped me feel more comfortable in tapping into that creative side, because the creative side of me has been kind of bottled up for so many years that was probably the hardest part of the process. And so what was interesting is as I continued on my journey of writing this children's book, I realized that I do have this creative side, and utilizing the creative side gave me this new found passion and energy. This book was a COVID project, and Ruxana, as you mentioned, I'm a mom, I was running my business. So I think a lot of us can attest to the fact that we were pretty burnt out. So going through this journey, finding that creative side actually helped fill me up during a time in which a lot of us kind of were probably very low energy, right? Or just didn't have much else to give. So it was an interesting journey for me to tap into that.
Yeah, I love this whole COVID burnout situation here, because I feel like I have some moms here, I can look at them, and that actually is a very good segue into Godhuli's writing, because Godhuli, you've written about motherhood experiences, and I guess a lot of your poetry for this current book was probably drafted in the COVID pandemic time frame. And sorry for being sneaky, but of course I've looked up your background, and I know you have a marketing background, and now you've sort of gone into writing, and that's a shift as well. Mm-hmm. So tell me, as you were writing this book and, sort of really putting down your personal experiencing and sharing it out with the world, was this a bit scary? Because this is your personal stuff out there. And also did you receive feedback which sort of made you feel, should I be doing this? Is this a part of the process that some people might really push back? Or I don't even know, what was the creative process through this? Because you're sharing very personal experiences.
Yeah, it's a great question. So as you said, I actually have a journalism and marketing background. I worked in corporate communications for 10 years, so that was my career focus. And then I chose to take a career break after having my first daughter. And then when I had my second child during the pandemic is when I really started writing poetry. And for me, it started as a very solo, sort of isolated process. It was just me nursing my baby and writing these almost journal entries is what I would call them initially. I didn't even give myself permission to call it poetry initially. And I started just sharing them on Instagram on a complete whim. As you said, it is a very scary, daunting experience to be so vulnerable with work that's so deeply personal. And initially, I didn't even invite my friends or family to join or read into it. It was sort of almost like a stranger speaking out into the void just to see if it would form a connection with other people. And it was so wonderful and surprising to see that. I always find that vulnerability leads to community and leads to connections. And I found that people were really appreciating how honest I was being about my motherhood experience. And that sort of led to a community and the book.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, I have to remind myself, like, the internet is sometimes a rewarding tool like that if used in that way, and it can also be hard because it's tough to put yourself out there with your thoughts. And that actually brings me to Akanksha. I mean, she probably does something that I would literally never be able to do. I just have no such presence. Akanksha, I mean, you go in front of people and you do comedy, which I think is also really hard to write. And sometimes people forget about how hard it is to actually create even like a simple joke they might laugh at, but you've probably gone through a lot of process in your head to be able to create that moment for people. So tell us, like, you have a writing background. It might be different writing, but I know that you're doing a lot of comedy now as well. So what is your process in really, like, if you're in a group of friends and you have an experience and you need to translate that into something you're sharing on stage, like, what does that take? How do you do it? How do you handle and build those moments?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just for a little additional background too, my full-time work is actually in kids and family writing. So I'm a full-time TV writer on a kids show called Blippi. It's for really, really little kids, 2 to 4-year-olds. And I think that it actually informs my stand-up and my other writing really, really well, because the thing about writing for kids, especially kids of that demographic, the 2 to 4-year-olds, is you can't waste words, you can't skirt around, you can't really make the messaging more complicated than it needs to be. So I sort of take the same principles that I use in my full-time writing and apply them to stand-up in the sense of, okay, well, this is an idea, but because stand-up is conversational, it's easy to sort of get lost and make something really long-winded. But I'm able to sort of just drill things down to the very essence of what I want to communicate with that joke or with that idea, because of my kids' TV background. So if I have an idea, I'll pretty much, like, my notes app is the most chaotic place on earth. So I'll pretty much just go in my notes app. I'll write maybe 1 or 2 sentences. And then later, when I'm actually doing dedicated writing time, which I think is really important for writers to just have dedicated chunks of time, when I'm doing that, I will kind of go in, build it out. I honestly kind of work backwards, where I already know what the joke is, and then I work backwards to like the setup and including a specific story or a specific example. Because the thing about stand-up too is that it's only funny because there's universality and specificity. So when you're saying something really specific, you're still saying it in a way that a larger audience can understand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes 100% sense. I think I say it in every workshop I host that, the more specific you make it, the more general it becomes. Like, you have to, like, even if it's a love story with very specific elements, you have to have some universality to it so that people can connect no matter who they are. And, because you mentioned Blippi, like, I could see people nodding because everyone watches Blippi. Like, that has saved my life in the pandemic. Like, I need some 10 minutes of time, and Blippi does that so well with high quality. So I appreciate the work you're doing. It keeps a lot of parents sane, I would say. I mean, I'm not going to be the judgmental parent saying, let's not watch TV. We do, and especially with programming that is like good quality. So I appreciate what you're doing. And, because you started talking about tools, I was looking at Godhuli because she was nodding, and in my head, I was kind of like, oh, I need to ask her this question. What are some of the tools you're using, Godhuli? Because, your poetry, I recently read what you wrote for your dad on Father's Day, and I was like, oh my God, like, this is so, it was just like, it had just exactly what you would want to say. And those are experiences that don't get recorded a lot, especially in the South Asian context. So I want to know, like, what's your process? How do you sort of document what's floating in your head?
That's such an interesting question because it's so different for every single piece. I mentioned this recently on another podcast. Sometimes poems will just come to me. Like, they're a piece of art that just enter my body. Like, while I'm in the shower or doing something, they'll come to me fully formed, almost as if I'm supposed to be the carrier of the piece. Other times I'll have like an idea, a question, an issue that I will want to explore. And I sit down, play music, and just allow myself to explore that concept. And as a poet, I think sometimes there's confusion between poets and philosophers. I don't try to solve every question out there. I don't claim to have the answers out there. For me, I just want to observe things in a poetic and artistic manner. And I love what you said, Akanksha, about, being nuanced and being very specific and how that can become very universal as well. I found that the more nuanced and specific that my writing is, like the piece that you mentioned about my father, that's a very specific trait about immigrant fathers, right? Mm-hmm. Like communicating through email, not being super comfortable using, love languages and words of affirmation. That's so specific to Indian fathers, right? And I find that the more specific I am, and I used to shy away from this initially because I didn't want to alienate, my non-Indian audiences or people who might not completely resonate with my experiences. But I find that actually the more nuanced and specific I am, the more that does resonate with all types of populations.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And, this actually is, Anjali, I'm going to draw you in here because I know that when you wrote the book that you did, you probably had your daughter in mind. I don't know if that was the ideal reader, but I know that, this is something a lot of kids would benefit from learning. Like, just as what Godhuli was saying, a lot of people, like, even if it is about, the South Asian experience, that doesn't mean that other people don't find that interesting. Did you have that in mind when you were writing to sort of create that universality? Like when you were writing, was that part of how you were thinking?
Yes, so it's interesting because it did start off as like, a gift for my daughter for her to have a book that she can really see herself in. I think all of us as parents or anyone where there's a child in our life are, looking for that inclusive bookshelf. And I know growing up, like there was not one single book that featured like a South Asian child, right? Like maybe brown, maybe, but like there was nothing, right? So I really wanted her to have this. And when I started kind of going down the rabbit hole of what to write about, which, I have like journals and journals filled with various topics, I wanted to make sure that, the universality was there, right? Not only was this going to be like a gift for my daughter and also a book that other South Asian families could have, but I also wanted it to be a book that non-South Asians would have to better understand something in our culture that maybe has negative stigma, maybe is misunderstood. So that's why I specifically wrote about eating with our hands, because it was something that we do every day in our household. And personally, I didn't even know why do Indian people eat with their hands until I started researching, right? And that goes kind of back to my analytical side where I'm like, let me research why we do this. And then once I learned about like the beauty and our connection with nature, I was like, this is really special. And that's why I made sure that even after I created the story, that the back matter of the book had a topic or had a section that was for parents and educators, right? To further explain it. Because not only did I want this book to be, this wonderful story that teaches children about something we do in South Asian culture, but also as a tool, like an educational tool for people to better understand other cultures. Because I think, while going through this process, I, have met so many people who are really looking for that inclusive bookshelf, really looking for books like this to help their children better understand other cultures. And I really do feel like this generation, like my daughter's generation, they're going to be the generation that brings change into the world. And books are such a great way to help push for that change.
Yeah. And I think, this is, and I guess like, I guess maybe now I'm in the bubble where I meet so many of you guys who are doing incredible work that I definitely feel that South Asian writing in general is having a moment. Like, and Akanksha, I'm going to bring you in because you're in a slightly different format. So I want to ask you that how do you see if you were to pitch like a stand-up show to a very mainstream place? Like what kind of responses are you seeing from people who are sort of putting up these shows? Do they want to have people like you there, or do you like, what kind of a response are you seeing? Because I'm curious to see that, we think that's the right thing to do, but is that what you're seeing from a demand perspective as well?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you ask me this, just because like, even as a South Asian comedian or a writer, I am sort of multidisciplinary, but the work and the voice that I have is the same across all platforms. And I actually run into the same issue across all platforms. So as a screenwriter, I have the same issue. As a stand-up comic, I have the same issue. And as a prose writer, I have the same issue. And that is that there is a very specific South Asian narrative that the mainstream media tends to favor. And that is the never have I ever narrative. That is the child of immigrant narrative. And me personally, my story is just a little bit different. Like, I moved here from Mumbai when I was 17. So I was already born and raised in India. And so I don't have that same experience that most South Asian comedians bring. In fact, I am a little uncomfortable being associated or lumped in with that experience personally. And so I definitely have faced the kind of backlash that comes in the form of, well, what does this work say about your culture? Or what does this say about India? And my response to that always is, well, my cultural identity is a very important part of me, but it is not definitive of every single experience that I have. I am still a human being having a human experience. And the persona that I sort of assign to myself is Bollywood Fleabag, because I want Indian women and I want Indian people in general to have that liberty to have complex and nuanced narratives that aren't just fitting into, oh, my parents have an accent and I'm going to go make fun of it on stage for 15 minutes. That's not what I'm here to do. And so any resistance that I face is basically in terms of, well, South Asian writing is so trendy and it's so cool, but only if it's like this, especially in Hollywood. It's only if it's this, only if it's in some way self-deprecating, only if it's in some way pandering to a white audience. And, I personally am just never going to do that. So I continue to just, my solution to work against that, I guess, is to create and continue to share stories as a young immigrant across multiple platforms and disciplines until someone listens.
That's really incredible that you said that, because I feel that, it's something I hear a lot from writers, and it's my personal experience as well, that we tend to lump all brown stories as one, when it's not a monolith. We are so diverse as a demographic, if I can call it that. And even if you were even I grew up in India, and even in India, people, depending on where you're from, urban, rural, big city, small city, the experiences are so distinctly different that, you can't put them as one. And I guess that generalization that happens is the way for people to simplify, right? I mean, they want to sort of put a label, or they want to put you in a box that is comfortable. And we have a running joke with a friend of mine that we talk about, but does your story have the mango? Because how can the Indian summer not have, it's a funny thing, but we just keep pushing each other, because sometimes in our own writing, we are does it need to have South Asian elements? Can it not just have regular life elements? Because not everything that we do is going to sort of pander to, like you were saying, a white audience, or be sort of center itself around the white gaze. But at the same time, we should be who we are, right? And so,
Right.
Godhuli, I'm going to bring this question to you a little bit. I know that, when you grew up here and you talked about the impact some writers had, for example, Jhumpa Lahiri, who explained the immigrant experience that you related to. How did that, how do you see yourself? You're not just this one person who's had ABC type of experiences, but you, in your poetry, depending on what you're writing about and what's going on in your head, it may or may not be about how people see you or want to put you in this box. How do you sort of process that within you? How do you write just as a mom and not as a South Asian mom? Or do you intentionally try and put these elements in your writing?
Yeah, so just to take a step back, I actually also have a little bit of a different background. I consider myself a third culture kid because I grew up around the world, moving around every 4 years. My dad worked for a multinational oil company. So I've grown up in the Middle East, France, Indonesia, Texas. I also lived in Mumbai and graduated high school from there. And then, moved here for college, lived in Canada for a little bit. So I also consider myself a first generation immigrant, but with a little bit of a different background than most. I have this, global worldview. And I think that really has lent my voice in poetry. I think my approach is to be as specific and authentic as possible about my experience. I write about my parents, moving around to different cities and having to navigate the new cultures and the new languages. We're a Bengali family, so the first thing that they would do is always look for the fish market, whether it was Paris or Jakarta. And so I write about those specific experiences. And again, as I was saying in the beginning, I would shy away from that. I was more concerned about writing about this universal motherhood experience, but I found that people really, really resonated with those very specific nuanced stories, even if it's not something that they could specifically relate it to. They could connect with the authenticity of those stories, and they still were able to connect with that experience in some way. So for me, this immigration is a huge theme of my poetry, and not just, as you said, it really also bugs me when people mock their parents' Indian accents. For me, it's taking a more, nuanced, multidimensional view of what immigration and what exposure to different cultures and navigating these different identities, what that looks like. Those are big themes in my poetry.
Yeah, I love that. And thanks for clarifying your background. I didn't know you'd actually moved around so much.
I know, I have an American accent, so everyone assumes that I grew up.
I know.
Because
I think it's because I guess the first time we spoke, you said you're in Chicago. So somehow in my head, I sort of assumed that, because we've had one more author who's had a similar background, and she shared an interesting story that she had an American accent. It's actually Jyoti Gopal. I don't know if you've seen her work. She wrote The American Desi, a children's book.
Oh, okay.
And so she came in here, but she studied in American schools all across the world. And then she came to America and had a very American accent. And people sort of assumed that she grew up here, and she had to sort of work through, really being herself and being comfortable with her multiple identities or things that she had sort of learned across the world. So it sort of reminded me of her experience as you were talking. Anjali, as you've written something, as Godhuli was speaking, I was kind of thinking that, you've talked about a topic which is South Asian, where you are sort of questioning a stigma or sort of explaining something to someone who might not know something about your culture. How do you create that balance? And I'm going to give you an example of why I'm asking this question, but these two wonderful women are sort of making me go in that direction. How do you sort of strike a balance at describing a story but not over explaining? And I'll give you an example of why I'm saying that, because I'm currently reading a book that I love, because I grew up, a large part of my life was in Delhi, and this is by an author from Delhi, and she's talking about a story from Lahore, the partition and all of that. It has incredible themes, but it has sentences which are killing me. For example, it says "Tayyar, ready," which is it's constantly explaining the Hindi word, and it has so much of that it is killing me now. That who is it for? It's making me question who was she writing for, that she was so eager to explain the meaning right away. And some writers who are very accomplished, for example, like a Salman Rushdie or a Jhumpa Lahiri, who also take up these themes, do not over-explain. Somehow they have this in their writing, that they are able to say the things without having to over-explain. And that's really hard to achieve as a new writer. So I want to know, did you have that tendency to say, let me go explain this concept now, or let the story be? Because over-explaining sometimes is just too hard on the reader. So I would love to know that.
Yeah, when I set out to write the book, I was writing it for a South Asian audience. So I decided from the beginning I wasn't going to over-explain. I think because I come from a very corporate background, right? I've spent my whole life navigating white spaces. And so once I, started my own financial planning firm, I was like, I'm not doing that anymore, right? I'm going to be my authentic self, and being my authentic self is also to be I'm a South Asian woman in a profession that has very little people that look like me, right? And so when I approached the book writing process, which also has the same lack of representation, I approached it in a very similar fashion, right? I was like, I'm writing this for a South Asian audience, and if people who are not South Asian resonate with it, great, but I'm not going to cater the book to a non-South Asian audience, right? Because this was really something that was a passion project for me. And as someone who's always had to navigate white spaces and deciding I'm not going to do that professionally anymore, or not to the same extent I was before, I made sure that I wasn't doing that in terms of the book I was writing. So I wanted the story to speak for itself. So, I do mention a lot of Indian foods in there, like paratha and dosa, and I don't explain. There's a lot of, I know we all have, and I think those books are great where they explain at the back, this is what dosa is, this is what paratha is. And I'm like, I'm not going to do that. If you would like to know, you can Google it, right? And so when I read the book to like a children's audience, right, when I do book readings and stuff, I do explain it to the kids because that's, you know, part of the story. But I wasn't going to over explain things like that, right? I just wanted the story to kind of narrate itself, and I wanted to keep the story on a more positive, upbeat note. So when I wrote kind of the original draft of the story, I focused more on the negative stigma. Like the book starts with, you know, Nyla eating paratha at school and noticing her friends eat differently. And when I first wrote the book, it was like the little boy said, "Ew, why are you eating with your hands?" And so, you know, the people I was working with who helped me kind of get the book to the finish line said that, you know, there are a lot of kids who will read this book who don't have that negative stigma yet. So why put that in their mind, right? You can get to the same message without having any negative element into it, right? And I think some of it was like my frustration, like, I'm going to put this in there, right? And then I was like, you know, that was really insightful for me. And, you know, and I loved how the story turned out without any of those negative stigmas in there, right? It's just, it's this beautiful story and it evolves on its own. And I think that people, whether they eat with their hands or they don't, or want to learn about cultures, can still get the same message and story out of it, whether they identify with that culture or not. So it is like a very difficult balance, I will say. But I think I was just very intentional in terms of how I approach that. And I think that's what it comes down to at the end of the day, right? It's like our intention, our approach, and then who we want the book to resonate with. And I think that helps put those steps in place in terms of how we go through that storytelling process.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I'm going to pass it on. Anyone, Akanksha or Godhuli, you can answer. I mean, I'm really curious about you because your work is a little more personal. I mean, all writing is personal. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, I'm just, as I think about poetry and comedy, you know, those, you know, I somehow, maybe because I don't do them myself, so maybe this is coming from like a naive, you know, place. But I would love to know that, you know, who are you writing for? Is this a platform for you to express yourself? Or is there an ideal reader that you're hoping to engage with? When you start, you know, like Godhuli, you were describing that sometimes a poem would just come to you in the shower. Who is it for? Like, I would love to know, like, what is your process like that? Because typically when I teach people, I'll be like, okay, dear mom, it has to be like, choose one reader to make it reader centric. But I'm curious, like, how do you approach your work?
For me, at the risk of, you know, sounding a little bit cheesy, it's honestly for my inner child. It's for this shy little, you know, repressed young woman who was so confused about her identity, lacked confidence about her identity. And my entire poetry journey has been this therapeutic experience to make that young girl really own her identity. And a lot of my poetry, especially this newer phase of my poetry, is about reclaiming your cultural heritage, reclaiming your power, reclaiming your identity. I have a piece in my collection called About My Name. I have a very complicated name. It's Godhuli. And honestly, for most of my life, I passed as Godhuli because that was just easier for the Western tongue to pronounce. And I didn't have it in me to constantly correct my name over and over again. And, you know, this current phase of my journey is about owning the incredible history and linguistic beauty of that name. It's something that my father picked. He's a lover of the Sanskrit language. So yeah, the work is very, very much for myself. In fact, when I initially wanted to publish the book, it was really for myself to have a physical manifestation of all my work from the pandemic. And it's just such a beautiful, you know, plus point that it has resonated with a community of mothers, of immigrants, of women. So yeah, it's for my inner child.
Okay, that's incredible. Akanksha, do you want to speak a little bit about it?
Yeah. So like I said, I'm a multidisciplinary artist. So I would say that I agree with Godhuli in the sense of like, yes, primarily this work is for me and my self-expression. Like even the way that I got into stand-up was because at the time I was working in corporate at Disney Channel and I just felt very much like a spicy cog in the machine. I felt like I immigrated to the United States and I went through this whole journey and all I was doing was sending emails like everybody else. And I wanted to make sure that my voice and my journey didn't get lost just because I was in this phase, or I was doing this work and this was my full-time job, and stand-up became that place where I could really sort of express my voice. And it also really came from a desire for representation in some ways, because I, to be honest, have never felt represented by Indian Americans and by the Desi diaspora. It's a completely different experience to actually immigrating from there and having to build your own life from scratch. So most of my work comes from a desire for representing the very specific experiences that I had, because in Hollywood, it's very like representation matters. And I guess sometimes you have to create that representation for yourself, especially when you belong to a very niche identity. So my stand-up is for anyone, like really any person of color, any young immigrant, anyone who has basically had the experience of feeling like a fish out of water and observing things from that standpoint. But my Cutting Chai series, or my video essay series on TikTok, that is a little more personal. That is a little more authentic. That gets into themes of like family estrangement and mental health and things like that. And that was like very similar to what Godhuli said. It started as like, well, I just really need these parts of myself to live somewhere and be expressed. I just need these parts of myself to be expressed. And I did not expect the reception and community and the way that other people resonated with it to follow that. It definitely started from a place of, well, this just needs to live somewhere outside of me. I can't contain everything that I'm feeling or thinking about right now. And I think that the TikTok or the video essays became like a visual journal for me to sort of chronicle my own experiences and thoughts. So I definitely have a very similar kind of artist journey to Godhuli.
It's very interesting you're saying that, obviously, it looks like I'm older than you. So I'm going to say this, like I had this exact moment, probably early 2000s, when people started blogging. And I was like, I need this part of my life to be documented. I was still in college, but I started doing that exactly the way you're describing the video series. Of course, I didn't choose such a cool name like Cutting Chai. I actually chose it based on a Calcutta pub where I'd never been, but somehow was in my head, like this creative space, and it was called Someplace Else. And that was like, so
I love that.
It feels very childish, but at that time, I'm a teen and I have this like whole sense of rebellion to create and to express who I am. And that sort of became the project. And I've never stopped doing it. Like I've been doing it 20 years because I just feel that it is that the engagement with your creative self, and you find a place to tangibly see it. That's how it began for me. So a lot of like writers and creators sort of will have these kinds of documented projects, I would say, somewhere or the other. So I love that you described both those different elements. And, this brings me to probably you guys are all multitaskers and have multiple things that you're doing at the same time. So I'm going to begin with Anjali again. How do you stay motivated to be creative? Because you're also doing so many different things. Like even if you didn't have another job, you're still a mom which is a full-time job. So how do you keep yourself motivated to stay creative?
Yeah, honestly, I feel like, the next wave of innovation, the next wave of careers is going to be people who are slashies, right? People who are multifaceted, do different things. So like, my parents' generation, which my parents are here supporting me and my sister, so it's very sweet. It was very much, and I come from, my parents immigrated here. I was born here, so that's my background. And so, when my parents immigrated and were raising us, it was very much like, find that stable job and stay in that job until you retire. And now what's happening, right, is that we want diversification of income streams. So we don't want to just focus on one path because A, I find that very risky. And B, I think all of us have multiple facets to ourselves and our personality. And for, my generation, I want a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. So for me, I'm always going to be a numbers person, right? Like I'm a CPA by training. I transitioned to financial planning. But what the book has given me is like another outlet for a creative side that I did have as a child that I've kind of have suppressed for so long just because of the professional route that I took in terms of my, earlier career. But what's interesting for me is how I'm now taking the creative side that has, sprouted from the book writing process, and now applying it back into my financial planning profession. So a lot of like the work that I want to start doing is to understand how culture, background, ethnicity, how parents raised us, how those facets impact how we view money, right? Because I work with, a very diverse client base, which I love. And I've noticed that a lot of our ability to make good financial decisions stems from trauma, stems from blockages, stems from things that we may be carrying. And I know personally I have done this. And so for me, it's been interesting to start looking at the financial planning side in that more creative way to see how can I make an impact in my clients' lives so that they feel empowered to make these decisions for themselves. And then how can I advocate that in my profession? Because the profession is changing in terms of it not just being wealthy people managing their money. It's really understanding this, view on how money and emotion tie together. And that's how we make a bigger impact. And money is something that's such a big part of so many people's lives. And so how do we use money as a tool, not money as something that may create trauma or emotional incapacity, right? So it's been an interesting journey for me to just kind of start blending more of the creative side in a profession that's very analytical. I'm very early stages of it, so I don't know what's going to come out of it, but it's been fun for me because it's giving me, that sense of fulfillment and filling me back up that there's something, new and exciting that I can really start working on and, leveraging kind of my creative side with the books process and wearing that hat across the multidisciplinary facets that, I'm operating in currently.
It's very interesting you're saying, like, I spent 20 years in corporate life, so I totally can relate to that, but also because there was so much push, for example, I give you an example in the University of Michigan, because obviously it's like the university, so they probably are like usually leading these kinds of things, but they were talking about training leaders, including like CEOs or anyone at the CXO level, with creative programs instead of just having them focus on MBA type training for exactly what you're describing, because it's very hard to teach empathy to someone. You almost want to have experiences which can lead them onto the path of realizing why it's important and then responding the way that, makes people feel seen. And, that needs to start all the way from the top in many organizations. So this kind of creative leadership building is something I've been hearing from that perspective as well. So super interesting how, you can take back what you've learned from like a...
Yeah. And, I was reading an article about, like with the emergence of AI and that kind of being the new technology that leads us into the future, the professions that are going to be tapped are the creative professions, because they want the creatives to be able to come in and navigate the AI. Because the AI is going to take care of the analytical part. It's the creatives that are going to help shape that. So I found that very interesting because it's something that I feel like just, in our culture in general, at least from my experience, like, it was the creative side was never the side where we would fully pursue, right? It was like the hobby. It was a thing that was kept on the side. It was very much focused on all the analytical aspects in terms of our professional career. So I'm very interested to see how that's going to shift over time.
Actually, I'm gonna ask Godhuli this question. You've come from this corporate environment, and it's like, I don't know, this is just a question because I'm curious as a reader. Like, is the creative profession, poetry and writing, going to be a full-time profession? Is that where you feel you're going, where your heart is leading you? Because is that a switch you're intentionally making now?
Yeah, absolutely. It is where my heart is leading to. It's what I've always wanted. And, I feel like I was lucky as the South Asian child to be able to pursue journalism, which was, a little different than what most South Asian kids were encouraged to pursue. But even then, I chose a path in corporate communications for financial services companies because it was stable. It was, what would allow me to be financially independent. But, now that I have the privilege to be able to step away from that corporate career. And I think that's very important to acknowledge because I recognize that not everyone has that privilege. And for me, it is important, primarily I'm a stay-at-home mom. That's, what my primary job is, but on the side, I'm also a writer and a creative entrepreneur. So I feel like right now I have the balance that I've always dreamed of because I get to pursue, my passion and what my heart has always wanted, which is to be a writer, but to also be able to have time for my very young children. So yes, and hopefully, you know, that can evolve into something that is more financially sustainable as well. I think right now there's so many different paths, and I think that pursuing a creative path is, you know, definitely something that the next generation should consider for, you know, the reasons that Anjali mentioned. And yeah, who knows what the next industry is going to be for our kids. So I think what's most important is to, you know, have good leadership skills, be able to think creatively, and to be able to pivot as well.
Yeah, I love that. I love the fact that, you know, you have pivoted yourself. So I guess you're a role model for people who probably are doing something, but, you know, this is one way to follow your heart when you really do allow yourself to like do what you really want to, what you strongly, deeply feel about. And I think, you know, a lot of the times, like, we are driven by this whole productivity culture. I hear this like as a mom, because I feel like at one point at the peak of like maybe the pandemic, when I was like struggling with the job and like wanting to be creative and also having a child, it is a very hard balance to sort of find, and to be able to do something about it intentionally and say, hey, here is what I'm going to do, is very courageous and brave. So I hope that you're saying that to yourself, because I think it's not easy to sort of say, you know, this is what I'm going to do now, even if it comes with privilege, because you still have to make that decision, and that's not easy, especially when you've like done things in a different way before. So I appreciate this. That is like very brave to take up something creative. And Akanksha, it looks like, you know, have you always done this? Because you said you came here as a 17-year-old. Did you always know you wanted to be creative and an artist? How did it feel for you?
Yes, absolutely. I came when I was 17 on a scholarship to Boston University. So it was a very interesting path, just because my parents were not well off in the sense of being able to send me to an American school. It all kind of happened very suddenly. And I chose to major in film and television just because I grew up in Bollywood. So I was very immersed in the film and TV world. And honestly, I had creative parents, so it wasn't like a huge, you know, oh my God, she's not going to be a doctor. It wasn't anything like that. I didn't know that I would want to do stand-up specifically. I actually didn't start doing stand-up until I was like 27. I always had the dream of being kind of an author, like a prose writer. And so I still do write prose. But when I moved to LA, it became very like, well, you should be a screenwriter. You need to sell a pilot. It was kind of like I had to translate my writing into, I guess, a format that made sense for where I had moved to and where I was living. So stand-up was kind of where I started with exploring what my comedic voice might be, exploring what my voice in a different format might be. And then I continued to sort of do, I don't know if anyone has heard of NPR's The Moth, but I do storytelling on The Moth, and then I also do prose. So I guess the balance with all of that is I do have to have a full-time job. I cannot quit my job. I don't have financial support, but I spend a lot of time commuting. And so I'll be editing my cutting chai videos on the commute, or I'll be coming up with ideas kind of on the way to an open mic. So it's not a very buttoned up process in terms of like, oh, I set time to do this and set time to do that. I just kind of, because I think I have the privilege of being able to express myself through multiple disciplines, I just kind of see how I'm feeling that day and go with that impulse and write accordingly, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's mostly in creative professions like this, especially with writing. I've at least not found this thing that, you know, if I put a deadline and say, I'm going to do this like 4 pages today, it rarely happens with me, at least. I mean, there's something to be said about process and practice. Like if I write every day, it absolutely engages my creative energy and sort of like I'm able to build on that. But I have never been able to do that. Oh, I need to produce a children's book tomorrow and I'll do it today. That probably is less likely to happen. But practice matters. Yeah.
I think that there is something of a system, right? Because now there's a substantial amount of followers to the Cutting Chai series. So I can't just go 3 months without posting one, or I can't just, so there's like a certain checks and balances with it, but I try not to put this productivity and this pressure and this capitalistic lens onto something that I'm genuinely creating from my heart as a form of self-expression, because I know that the moment I do that, I'm not doing it from a place of love anymore. I'm doing it from a place of, I need to get something out of this. And I have never, ever created from that place.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love the fact that you you already know about it, because sometimes in my own process, like sometimes it's been hard for me because, I've also like a lot of people here have had like a job where you might also require writing, and then you have like what you've seen as a hobby, which sometimes takes up a larger part of your life and then becomes your life.
Absolutely.
So that transition is like, it's just a process to manage that as well. We have a few minutes. I'm loving this conversation. You guys are like so amazing. So, but before I pause, and I want to make sure that we are respectful of everyone's time, I do want to actually go around the table and ask you guys that what we should be expecting next as readers, as people who love your work. Where can we find you and what's coming up next? So anyone can start. If not, I'm going to pick Anjali. You're going to go ahead because you're like literally on the left side of my screen. So I always pick on her. Tell me what's coming up next from your desk.
Yeah, I don't know. So that's what it is. Like what Akanksha, what you said so much resonated, because I think I took a similar approach with the book. I didn't view the book the way I view kind of like my financial planning business. I came at it from a place of like, no deadlines, I'm just going to do it from my heart. I'm just going to let it take it to where it needs to go, because once I put those deadlines or put that monetary aspect on it, the joy of it came out. So I'm just allowing myself to have some time and space to see what comes next. And for me, that's very hard to do. I'm very much like a goals driven person, but I want to give myself permission to just have that time and space and see kind of what comes up. But you can follow me. I have a website, anjalijariwala.com. It talks about kind of the various hats I wear. There's also a link to purchase the book, Why We Eat With Our Hands. And yes, I appreciate you having me on this panel. It was a great discussion with these wonderful ladies.
Yeah, no, I love it. And, I'm going to go now to Godhuli. You just published, but I still want to know what's coming up. What do you think?
Yeah. Right now I'm deep in the launch of my poetry collection, Desert Marigold, available on Amazon. I am a typical Pisces. I go with the flow and kind of see where inspiration takes me, but I'm always creating new work, and I definitely want to work on my next poetry collection, and I'm excited to see where that will lead me thematically. For me, the process is to, develop poetry first and then kind of compile them together to see what the story and the narrative is. I always work on commissioned projects as well. So people and brands can reach out to me for commissioned poetry, and that's always a very satisfying project for me. I love working on them. I get to do deep dives with my clients and then develop a piece of poetry, either based on, I've done various milestones, whether it's memorials or anniversaries. A passion project that I have in mind is doing a collection for our mothers and grandmothers, because I think that their stories are so fascinating, and I think it's one that we take their roles for granted. I think they all have such incredible stories of sacrifice, and we sort of talk about it as if it's no big deal because all of our mothers and grandmothers have been through these experiences. But I would love to commemorate their stories in some way. I'm not quite sure how, but that's definitely something that I have in mind. You can follow me on Instagram. That's where I am most updated. My Instagram handle is wordsby.godhuli, and I also have a website, wordsbygodhuli.com.
Love that. And I'm going to come back to Akanksha now. What's coming up? Where can we find your work, first of all?
Sure. So the Cutting Chai series is available on both Substack and TikTok. That is a live series where the video essays live on TikTok, the words live on Substack. And the handle for that for both TikTok and Substack is I write under the pen name Daisy Buchanan, which is just like Daisy Buchanan, but with DESI, Daisy at the top. So there's going to be that. And I'm also building out my nonfiction essay collection. And I am also launching like a companion podcast for the cutting chai. So there's a bunch of things going on. The best platform that I currently have is either Instagram or TikTok, but the series actually lives on TikTok. So if you're interested in that, it's there. And I also work one-on-one with younger South Asian creatives who are looking to start creating and writing or doing stand-up or whatever it is they want to do.
Yeah, I love that. I love also like this. You're already like, it sounds like you're already thinking mentorship, because I think young people, especially, that's the reason I like to bring you guys together, because, you have no idea that how so many different people are going to hear this, and we're going to start getting direct messages saying, oh, can I follow this person's work? Because sometimes just this idea that I can do it, or someone else has done it, and, this is incredible, and I get inspired by it, is what people take from it. And that's our big reason for doing this series, because just hearing you guys talk about your process, just hearing you guys share, what are your projects, side projects, and upcoming dream projects is all something that we rarely get to hear from people of color and creatives of color. So having put together this series is literally to reach those younger people who are trying to do something but want to learn how and want to be inspired by you. So, just I want to appreciate all of you guys for giving us your time. First of all, being so generous and coming here, talking and having such an incredible conversation, and appreciate everyone who's here and supported. And like I said, anyone who missed out on any part of the program, which I've seen some names, so I know some people joined in late. We will send out the video later this week as well, so that everyone can see this. And you guys already know how to find all of our 3 amazing writers, but we will also send out their links via an email, so you know how to follow them. And as readers and as people who love your work, we will continue to stay inspired and follow you, so that each time there's a new project that drops, we can experience it and engage with it. Appreciate you guys a lot, and thanks so much for joining today, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much for hosting.